If you ever fall asleep in my class again, Mr. Brooks, at least make sure you're dreaming about passing the exam." That was what everyone expected Professor Adrian Hayes to say, because he had a reputation for being the coldest professor on campus, the kind of man who could silence a lecture hall with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. Instead, the first words he ever said directly to me changed my life in a way I never could have imagined. "My name is Ethan Brooks, and by the middle of my sophomore year, sleep had become something I remembered more than something I actually experienced. Every weekday started before sunrise with unloading delivery trucks at a grocery store, followed by classes that stretched into the afternoon, then an evening shift at a neighborhood bookstore until nearly midnight. Rent in Boston didn't care that I was a full-time student, and neither did my utility bills. Coffee stopped working weeks ago. Energy drinks just made my hands shake. By Thursday mornings, I was running on stubbornness alone. Professor Hayes taught American literature in one of the oldest buildings on campus, where tall windows flooded the room with pale autumn light and every wooden desk creaked if you shifted your weight. Students whispered that he had impossible standards, never smiled, and could spot someone checking their phone from 50 feet away. I had never tested those rumors because I always sat near the back, took careful notes, and tried very hard not to attract attention. That Thursday, however, my body made the decision for me. I remember writing half of a sentence about Walt Whitman. I remember blinking once. Then everything disappeared into warm darkness. When I opened my eyes again, sunlight had shifted across the floor, the classroom was completely silent, and someone was gently knocking on my desk with the edge of a hardcover book. My heart nearly stopped. I looked up into a pair of calm gray eyes framed by thin silver glasses. Professor Adrian Hayes stood beside me with the same composed expression he wore during every lecture. Behind him, every seat was empty. Every student had already left. My face burned so fast I thought I might actually catch fire. "I'm so sorry," I blurted, stumbling to gather my notebook. "I didn't mean to." He lifted one hand slightly, and somehow that tiny gesture stopped my entire apology. "Mr. Brooks," he said evenly, "would you stay for a few minutes?" That was it. No lecture. No sarcasm. No disappointment. Somehow that was worse. As he returned to the front of the room, I convinced myself my attendance grade was gone, my scholarship was probably next, and by sunset I'd somehow be living under a bridge with an overdue library book. My imagination had always been dramatic when I was exhausted. While Professor Hayes quietly organized the stack of essays on his desk, I noticed something strange. He hadn't looked annoyed when he found me asleep. If anything, he had looked concerned. I immediately dismissed the thought. Professors like Adrian Hayes didn't worry about students like me. They graded papers, assigned deadlines, and moved on. At least, that was what I believed as the last echoes of footsteps faded beyond the classroom door, leaving only the two of us in a room that suddenly felt much larger than it had an hour before. Professor Hayes waited until I had stopped nervously stuffing loose papers into my backpack before he finally looked up from the essays spread across his desk. The silence stretched so long that I started inventing reasons for it. Maybe he was deciding how severe the penalty should be. Maybe he was choosing the most professional way to tell me I did not belong at this university. I cleared my throat. I know falling asleep was disrespectful. It will not happen again. He rested his pen on the desk with careful precision. "That is the interesting part, Mr. Brooks." I blinked. "What is?" "You have fallen asleep 3 times this month." My stomach dropped. I had not even realized he noticed the other 2 times. "You always wake yourself before anyone else sees," he continued. "Today you were simply too exhausted." There was no accusation in his voice. Somehow that made me feel even more embarrassed. I looked down at my worn sneakers. "I have been busy." "Busy," he repeated quietly. "Or overwhelmed." I laughed once, mostly because I did not know what else to do. "Does it matter?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the classroom windows and looked out over the campus lawn, where students crossed between brick buildings carrying coffee cups and backpacks. They looked relaxed. They looked like people who had actually slept. "It matters if you are trying to earn a degree while slowly wearing yourself down," he said. I opened my mouth to offer another excuse, but nothing convincing came out. The truth sounded ridiculous even to me. I worked before class. Then after class. I guess I lost track of how tired I was. Professor Hayes nodded as though he had already suspected as much. "What time did your day begin?" 4:30 this morning. And what time did it end yesterday? Almost 1. He was silent again. I expected another lecture about time management or personal responsibility. Instead, he asked, when was the last time you had a full night of sleep? I searched my memory and realized I honestly could not answer. I do not remember. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. The stern professor everyone feared seemed to disappear for only a second, replaced by someone carrying an old sadness that did not belong in this room. Then it was gone. You are one of the strongest writers in this course, he said, sliding a graded essay toward me. A bold 98 was written across the top. Your work tells me you prepare. Your attendance tells me you care. Your exhaustion tells me something else entirely. I stared at the paper, convinced he had mixed it up with another student. I thought you probably hated my essays. One corner of his mouth almost became a smile before returning to its usual neutral line. If I disliked your work, I would have considerably more notes in the margins. I laughed despite myself. The sound surprised both of us. It was small, awkward, but real. He opened a drawer in his desk and placed a simple brass key beside my notebook. This belongs to the faculty reading room on the 3rd floor. Very few students know it exists. It stays quiet most afternoons. I frowned. Why are you giving me this? Because if you are determined to keep working impossible hours, I would rather you spend your breaks resting somewhere safe than collapsing at a classroom desk. I looked from the key to Professor Hayes, completely unsure how to respond. Every rumor I had ever heard about him suddenly felt incomplete. As I slowly picked up the key, I realized the coldest professor on campus had just shown me the first unexpected kindness I had received since the semester began. The brass key felt heavier than it looked. I turned it over between my fingers all afternoon, half convinced Professor Hayes would stop me in the hallway, clear his throat, and tell me he had made a mistake. He never did. Instead, I found myself standing outside a narrow wooden door on the 3rd floor of the Humanities building just before my evening shift at the bookstore. There was no sign except a tiny bronze plaque that simply read Faculty Reading Room. I slipped the key into the old lock, expecting an alarm to go off or a librarian to chase me away. The door opened with a quiet click. The room smelled like aging paper, polished oak, and fresh coffee. Tall bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, interrupted by wide windows overlooking the campus courtyard. A handful of leather chairs surrounded low tables scattered with literary journals, and a small fireplace flickered quietly in one corner, making the room feel less like part of a university and more like someone's forgotten library from another century. It was completely empty. I stood there for a full minute, unsure if I was actually allowed to be inside. Then I noticed a folded note resting beside a coffee machine. In careful handwriting, it read, "Students deserve quiet too. Help yourself." There was no signature, but somehow I already knew who had written it. I poured myself a cup of coffee, settled into one of the oversized chairs, and opened my backpack with every intention of reviewing tomorrow's reading assignment. I made it exactly 3 pages before my eyelids surrendered. When I woke again, soft orange sunlight had replaced the bright afternoon sky. For one terrifying second I thought I had overslept and missed work, but my phone showed only 28 minutes had passed. Somehow that short nap felt better than 8 restless hours in my apartment ever had. I stretched carefully and noticed something else. A folded gray blanket rested across the arm of my chair. I was absolutely certain it had not been there before. I looked around the empty room, confused. The coffee mug I had left on the table had also disappeared, replaced by a fresh paper cup that was still warm. My pulse quickened. Someone had been here while I slept. I hurried toward the door just as it opened from the other side. Professor Hayes stepped inside, carrying a stack of books balanced against his chest. He stopped when he saw me standing there with the blanket draped awkwardly over one arm. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at the untouched coffee in my hand and asked, almost casually, "Did you manage to get some rest?" I glanced down at the blanket. "Was this yours?" His eyes followed mine. "The building tends to get cold after sunset." That was not an answer, which somehow confirmed everything. I smiled before I could stop myself. "Thank you." He gave one small nod, as if gratitude embarrassed him more than compliments ever could. "You should head to work," he said. "You are going to miss your bus." I checked the time and realized he was right. I hurried toward the hallway before stopping at the doorway. "Professor." He looked up from arranging the books on a nearby shelf. "Yes, Mr. Brooks?" I held up the brass key. Do you really trust me with this? He considered the question for only a moment. No, he said in the same calm voice he used during lectures. I trust the person who continues showing up every morning despite being exhausted. Those are not the same thing. As I walked toward the bus stop with the key in my pocket and the warmth of an unexpected nap still lingering, I realized something had quietly changed. The reading room was no longer just a hidden place on campus. Somehow, without either of us planning it, it had become the one place where I finally felt seen. Over the next 2 weeks, the reading room quietly became part of my routine, almost like it had always been waiting for me. My mornings still started before dawn, my shifts at the grocery store were still filled with heavy boxes and freezing delivery trucks, and my evenings still disappeared behind the register at the bookstore. But somewhere between those impossible hours, I found exactly 30 minutes that belonged to no one except me. Every afternoon, I unlocked the old wooden door, poured a cup of coffee, and let myself breathe. Sometimes I actually studied. Sometimes I read novels that had nothing to do with assignments. Sometimes I simply closed my eyes long enough for the constant ache behind them to fade. It never failed. Every time I woke, the blanket was folded neatly beside my chair. Every single time. I never once saw Professor Hayes bring it in. I never heard the door open. It became our strange little mystery, one neither of us acknowledged. During lectures, nothing changed on the surface. He remained composed, precise, and impossible to read. His questions were just as challenging, and his standards never softened. If anything, he called on me more often than before, asking me to explain difficult passages or defend my interpretations. At first I wondered if he was testing me. Then I realized something surprising. He trusted my answers. One Thursday afternoon, after class ended, I lingered behind to return a reference book I had borrowed from the reading room. Professor Hayes was erasing the whiteboard with slow, absent movements. Without looking at me, he asked, "How is the bookstore?" I blinked. "It is busy. Holiday season begins soon. You remembered where I work?" The question escaped before I could stop it. He set the eraser down and finally met my eyes. "You mentioned it once." That was all he said, but somehow it unsettled me more than any compliment could have. I barely remembered telling him. He had remembered every detail. "Business should pick up next month," I said with an awkward smile. "More customers means more hours." "And less sleep," he replied. I laughed quietly. "Probably." He studied me for a moment, then opened a folder on his desk. "The English department is looking for a student assistant to help organize archived manuscripts and digitize research materials." I looked at him uncertainly. "That sounds like something graduate students do. Usually. So why are you telling me?" "Because it is a paid position. 15 hours a week. Flexible schedule. Indoors." I stared at him, my thoughts slowing as the meaning settled in. "You think I should apply?" "I think unloading delivery trucks at 4:30 every morning is not the only way to pay your rent." My chest tightened unexpectedly. Nobody had ever spent this much time trying to solve a problem that was not theirs. "There are probably students more qualified than me," I admitted. "Perhaps," he said calmly, "but there are very few who demonstrate your level of discipline." I looked away before he could notice how much those words affected me. Compliments had always made me uncomfortable, mostly because I was not used to receiving them. As I gathered my backpack, he added one final sentence in the same measured voice he used to discuss classic novels. "Mr. Brooks, working hard is admirable. Believing you must carry everything alone is not." I walked out of the classroom with the application form folded carefully inside my notebook, but it was not the paperwork that stayed on my mind during the bus ride home. It was the quiet certainty in Professor Hayes's voice, as though somewhere along the way he had started believing in my future long before I had managed to believe in it myself. I almost threw the application away 3 different times before I finally submitted it. Every version of the future in my head ended exactly the same way. Someone with perfect grades, polished recommendations, and a far more impressive resume would get the job instead. I was simply the exhausted kid who kept falling asleep whenever life became 5 minutes too quiet. Still, Professor Hayes had believed I should try, and somehow that tiny spark of confidence was enough to keep me from dropping the form into the recycling bin outside the administration office. 3 days later, my phone buzzed while I was stocking shelves at the bookstore. "Congratulations. You have been selected as the new archival assistant for the Department of English." I read the message 4 times before it finally felt real. The new position paid almost the same as my early morning warehouse shift, but the hours were flexible, the building was warm, and instead of lifting heavy boxes before sunrise, I would spend my afternoons preserving rare manuscripts and organizing historical collections. For the first time in months, I crossed one job off my schedule. My alarm moved from 4:30 to 6:30, and those extra 2 hours of sleep felt almost magical. It was amazing how different the world looked when my body was no longer constantly begging for rest. Colors seemed brighter. Conversations became easier to follow. Even my classmates noticed. One afternoon, my friend Olivia slid into the seat beside me before lecture began and stared at me suspiciously. "Okay," she whispered. "Who are you? And what have you done with Ethan?" I laughed. "What are you talking about? You actually have color in your face." She narrowed her eyes dramatically. "And you smiled before 8 in the morning. That has never happened. I have been sleeping a little more." "Impossible. Finals are coming." I shrugged, trying not to grin too obviously. "Miracles happen." Across the room, Professor Hayes arranged his notes at the front of the classroom. For just a second, our eyes met. He gave the slightest nod before beginning the lecture exactly on time. No one else seemed to notice, but somehow that tiny acknowledgement felt like sharing a secret hidden in plain sight. My afternoons in the archives settled into an easy rhythm. Dusty boxes became organized collections. Fragile letters written decades earlier passed carefully through my hands. Sometimes Professor Hayes stopped by to retrieve research materials for his own work. Our conversations remained brief and professional, usually about books, catalog numbers, or forgotten authors. Yet every time he entered the room, he somehow noticed the smallest details. "You replaced your backpack," he observed one afternoon while signing out a collection of 19th century journals. I glanced down at the inexpensive navy bag I had bought during a clearance sale. The zipper on the old one finally gave up. "This one suits you better." Another day, he placed a paper bag beside my desk without explanation. Inside was a blueberry muffin from the campus bakery. "They accidentally made too many," he said. Later that afternoon, I walked past the bakery and saw a sign hanging in the window that proudly announced "sold out." I smiled all the way back to the archives. He was not very good at pretending those small kindnesses happened by accident. The strangest part was how natural everything began to feel. There were no dramatic conversations or life-changing speeches. There were simply quiet moments that stacked together one after another, like books returning to the proper shelf. Somewhere between warm coffee, hidden blankets, handwritten notes, and impossible acts of thoughtfulness, Professor Adrian Hayes stopped being the intimidating professor everyone whispered about and quietly became the person I looked forward to seeing most each day, even though I still had not admitted that truth to anyone, especially not myself. The semester rolled forward with the quiet determination of falling snow. Nothing dramatic happened at first, which was exactly why I failed to notice the danger creeping in around us. I was sleeping more, my grades were climbing even higher, and the archival job felt less like work and more like an extension of the life I had always wanted. Every afternoon, I carefully cataloged old manuscripts while soft classical music drifted through the department office. Sometimes Professor Hayes stopped by with another stack of materials. Sometimes he simply asked whether everything was going well before disappearing into his office. Those brief conversations became the calmest moments of my day. I never realized how visible they had become to everyone else. It started with harmless jokes. "The professor definitely likes you," Olivia teased one morning after class. "He calls on you every lecture." I rolled my eyes. "Because he knows I actually do the reading." "Sure," she said with an exaggerated grin. "Keep telling yourself that." I laughed it off, but over the next week I noticed little things that had never bothered me before. Conversations stopped when I entered the student lounge. Two classmates glanced toward me, whispered something, and quickly looked away. Even people I barely knew suddenly smiled at me with a strange kind of curiosity. One afternoon, I walked into the archives carrying a box of donated journals and found a folded campus newspaper sitting on my desk. Someone had circled a small opinion column in red ink. It criticized universities for allowing favoritism between faculty members and student assistants. No names appeared anywhere on the page, but someone had written 3 words beneath the article in thick black marker. "We know." My stomach tightened. I immediately looked around the empty room, wondering who had left it there. Before I could throw the newspaper away, Professor Hayes entered carrying several reference books. His eyes moved from my face to the paper in my hands. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply understood. His expression grew unusually serious. "Where did you find that?" he asked quietly. "On my desk." He took the newspaper, folded it once, and placed it in his briefcase without another word. "You do not need to concern yourself with anonymous opinions." I tried to smile, but it came out crooked. "People think I only got this job because of you, do not they?" The silence answered before he did. He rested one hand lightly against the edge of the desk and looked toward the window instead of at me. People often create stories when they do not have facts. But they are talking. Yes. Does it bother you? He finally met my eyes again, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely tired. "It bothers me that your hard work is being questioned." I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. Maybe I should resign. The words hurt more than I expected. This job had given me sleep, stability, and hope. Giving it up felt like losing all three at once. Professor Hayes answered immediately. No, it was the firmest single word I had ever heard him speak. "You earned this position through your own ability. Then how do we stop the rumors?" He looked down for a long moment before quietly saying, "Sometimes the only way to protect someone is to become a little more distant." I stared at him, confused at first, until the meaning settled over me like cold rain. The next morning he taught his lecture exactly as always, except he never once looked in my direction. He did not call on me. He did not nod when class ended. When I passed him in the hallway later that afternoon, he acknowledged every student around us with polite professionalism. When it was my turn to walk by, he simply continued toward the opposite staircase as though I were any other face in the crowd. Somehow that silence hurt far more than anything the rumors ever could. For the next several days, I kept telling myself I was imagining the distance. Professor Hayes still answered my questions if I asked them. He still graded my papers with the same careful attention. He still treated me with perfect professionalism. That was exactly the problem. Everything warm had disappeared, leaving behind only the formal relationship we had before I ever fell asleep in his classroom. The reading room remained unlocked. The blanket still appeared beside my chair every afternoon, and fresh coffee somehow always waited on the table before I arrived. Yet I never saw him there anymore. It felt like receiving letters from someone who refused to sign their name. One rainy evening, I stayed later than usual in the archives, trying to finish cataloging a collection of handwritten journals before the weekend. The building had grown almost completely silent by the time I packed my backpack. As I walked past Professor Hayes' office, I noticed the light was still on. I should have kept walking. Instead, I knocked softly against the open door. He looked up from a mountain of research papers, clearly surprised to see me. "Mr. Brooks, do you have a minute?" He hesitated before quietly saying, "Of course." I stepped inside and closed the door halfway behind me. For several awkward seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I laughed nervously. "I used to think staying awake in your class was the hardest thing I would ever have to do." His expression softened just enough to show he remembered that day too. And now pretending nothing has changed is much harder. The room became painfully quiet. Rain tapped gently against the office windows. Somewhere down the hallway, an old heating vent hummed to life. Professor Hayes removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose like someone carrying a burden he had never intended to share. "Ethan," he said quietly, using my first name for the first time, "people are watching." Hearing my name in his voice nearly shattered every defense I had built over the past week. "I know they are." "Then you understand why this distance is necessary." "No," I admitted honestly. "I understand why you think it is necessary. That is different." He stood slowly and walked toward the window without looking back at me. "You deserve to finish your education without rumors following you." "And what do you deserve?" He did not answer. I took one careful step closer. "You helped me when nobody else noticed I was falling apart. You gave me a chance to sleep. You found me a better job. You believed in me before I believed in myself. Then one rumor appears, and suddenly I am supposed to act like none of that mattered?" His shoulders rose with a slow breath before falling again. "It mattered," he said so quietly I almost missed it. More than it should have. My heartbeat stumbled. I had promised myself I would never say the words forming in my chest, but keeping them inside suddenly felt impossible. "I look forward to seeing you every day," I confessed. "Not because you are my professor, because you are you. I admire your kindness, I admire your patience. Somewhere along the way, I started caring about you far more than I ever planned. He closed his eyes for a brief moment before turning to face me. There was unmistakable affection in his expression, but there was sadness too. If circumstances were different, he said carefully, perhaps I would tell you that hearing those words means more to me than you know. But today I am still your professor, and that responsibility comes before everything else, including my own feelings. Those final words landed with quiet honesty instead of rejection, and somehow that made them hurt even more. Life has a strange way of moving forward even when your heart insists on standing still. After that conversation, neither Professor Hayes nor I tried to reopen the subject. We did exactly what responsible adults were supposed to do. We focused on work. I buried myself in classes, research, and the archives. He returned to lectures, faculty meetings, and endless stacks of essays. The rumors slowly faded because there was nothing left for people to speculate about. We were careful, almost painfully careful. Winter arrived quietly, covering the campus in fresh snow that softened every familiar path between the old brick buildings. Final examinations came and went in a blur of late nights and library sessions, but this time exhaustion never defeated me. The archival position had changed everything. I was sleeping enough to think clearly, my grades were stronger than ever, and for the first time since starting college, I felt like I was building a future instead of merely surviving each week. On the afternoon final grades were posted, I found an envelope waiting on my desk in the archives. There was no name written on the front. Inside was a single sheet of stationery. Congratulations on earning the highest grade in American literature. I knew you could do it. The handwriting was unmistakable. There was nothing else. No signature. No unnecessary sentiment. Just one sentence that somehow meant more than an entire speech. I folded the note carefully and tucked it inside my favorite novel, where I knew I would never lose it. Spring arrived before I realized how much time had passed. Graduation decorations slowly appeared across campus. Families began booking hotels. Seniors counted down the remaining weeks with equal parts excitement and fear. I was one of them now. Standing in line to pick up my cap and gown felt surreal. Olivia nudged my shoulder and laughed. "Remember when you used to sleep through half your mornings?" she asked. "Now you are graduating with honors." I smiled. I remember someone who refused to let me give up. She assumed I meant her and proudly accepted the compliment. I did not correct her. On graduation day, sunlight spilled across the university lawn, and hundreds of black robes fluttered in the warm breeze. My parents sat near the front with expressions I had never seen before, somewhere between disbelief and overwhelming pride. As I crossed the stage and accepted my diploma, applause echoed across the courtyard. Out of instinct, my eyes searched the rows of faculty members. Professor Hayes was there among them, applauding politely with everyone else. For one brief moment, our eyes met. He smiled. It was small, quiet, and almost impossible to notice unless you were looking directly at him. But after everything we had shared, I recognized it instantly. Hours later, after photographs, hugs, and endless congratulations, the campus had nearly emptied. I wandered back toward the humanities building one last time, wanting to remember the place that had quietly changed my life. The third-floor hallway was just as silent as I remembered. The old reading room door stood slightly open. Inside, the familiar leather chair still faced the window, and neatly folded across its arm rested the same gray blanket. On the small table beside it lay the brass key I had carried for nearly a year. I picked it up gently, turned it over once in my hand, and smiled. A voice behind me broke the silence. "You can keep it if you would like." I turned around slowly. Adrian Hayes stood in the doorway without the formal distance that had separated us for so many months. He was no longer standing there as my professor. For the first time since we met, he was simply standing there as Adrian. For a moment, neither of us moved. The reading room was exactly as I remembered it, filled with late afternoon sunlight that painted long golden rectangles across the hardwood floor. Dust drifted lazily through the warm light, and somewhere outside the open window, I could hear distant laughter from graduates celebrating on the lawn below. Adrian stepped into the room with the same calm confidence he had always carried, but something about him felt different now. Perhaps it was because there was no lecture waiting to begin, no office hours, no assignments left to grade for me. The invisible line that had always separated us had quietly disappeared. I looked down at the brass key resting in my palm. I think it belongs here, I said softly. He smiled, the kind of genuine smile that transformed his entire face. Then let me rephrase that. I would like you to keep it because I want you to remember that this room was never just a place to sleep. I looked around slowly. The old shelves, the leather chair, the gray blanket folded with perfect care. Every corner held a memory. It became the first place where I stopped feeling like I was failing, I admitted. It became the place where someone finally noticed I was struggling before I knew how to ask for help. Adrian nodded quietly. I noticed because I have seen that kind of exhaustion before. I turned toward him. What do you mean? His gaze drifted toward the window for a long moment. When I was in graduate school, I believed working harder could solve every problem. I ignored my health, pushed away friends, and convinced myself that rest was something successful people earned instead of something every person deserved. I promised myself that if I ever became a professor, I would pay attention to the students who tried the hardest to hide how tired they really were. A gentle silence settled between us. Then he looked back at me with unmistakable warmth. Meeting you reminded me why I made that promise. I laughed quietly, shaking my head. You know, I spent months thinking you were the most intimidating person on campus. So I have been told. You were terrible at pretending you did not care. He actually laughed, soft and genuine, and I realized I had never heard that sound before. Apparently I was. We stood there smiling at each other like two people finally allowed to stop pretending. After another quiet moment, Adrian slipped both hands into his coat pockets and took a slow breath. Ethan, there is something I have wanted to ask for quite some time. My heartbeat immediately forgot how to behave. All right, you are no longer my student. He paused just long enough for hope to settle gently between us. Would you allow me to take you to dinner this evening? I could not stop smiling even if I had wanted to. Are you asking because you feel responsible for me? No, because you feel sorry for me. Definitely not. Then why? His answer came without hesitation. Because somewhere between a forgotten blanket, too many cups of coffee, and a student who kept insisting he was fine when he clearly was not, I found someone I deeply admire. I would like the chance to know him beyond these walls. I slipped the brass key into my pocket and picked up the folded gray blanket from the chair before walking toward him. In that case, I said, unable to hide my grin, I would love to have dinner with you. Together we stepped out of the reading room and gently closed the old wooden door behind us. As we walked across the quiet campus beneath the golden evening sky, I realized the day I accidentally fell asleep had never been the moment my life started falling apart. It had been the moment someone finally saw me, and because one kind professor chose compassion instead of judgment, both of us found a future neither of us had been looking for, but both of us were finally ready to embrace.